Last time I made a video about Gladiator where I spent 45 minutes explaining what is wrong with this movie and what is wrong with a typical presentation of ancient Rome in film and popular culture in general. This time, I'd like to do pretty much the opposite and recommend you a really good movie about antiquity. Probably one of my favorite movies about the ancient world, even despite the fact that it is set in a very problematic historical period, late 4th and early 5th century. Problematic, first of all, in terms of historical sources. The movie is called Agora. It was directed by Alejandro Amenábar and released in the year 2009. As you probably know, it is sometimes labeled as a science versus religion movie, which is kind of true. But I'd probably rephrase it as a reason versus religious obscurantism, or a reason versus the Abrahamic religions. Immediately after its release, the movie sparked a certain controversy in Europe over the depiction of ancient Christians, which is interesting. Nobody objects when another film adaptation of Quo Vadis is released and slanders the ancient Greco-Roman culture and tells wild stories that have nothing to do with history. This poisonous Christian propaganda is fine, but people should object. They really should. The depiction of Christians in Agora is indeed not very typical, and that's precisely one of the reasons why this movie is such a breath of fresh air. We can debate how accurate this depiction is, considering the horrible situation with the sources on late antiquity. But Amenábar tried to be conservative. His work is quite firmly based on the existing convention among scholars about the facts relating to this period. So, if anything, his version of early Christians is probably toned down a bit. They are shown as better human beings than they really were. In the case, they actually existed in this period. As you might expect, this video is mostly dedicated to the historical and ideological aspect of Agora. It is not a movie review per se. We're not talking much about the artistic qualities. Cinematically, it is a very good and very moving film that might make you feel quite emotional, especially towards the end. And unlike Gladiator, it has a script that makes sense. And obviously, good cinematography, acting, direction, etc. Now, back to the historical aspect. Agora is about Hypatia of Alexandria. Hypatia, who over time became some kind of a martyr of science and a heroic figure. She lived in Alexandria at the time of emperors like Theodosius, Arcadius, and Theodosius the Younger. The emperors who established Christianity as the official religion of the Roman Empire and started systematic persecutions of non-Christians. Hypatia was a philosopher/scientist. She ended up being involved in the political struggle between Patriarch Cyril and Prefect Orestes, and eventually was brutally murdered by the Christian fanatics in the year 415. As the director once said, this film is not against Christians, but rather against those who set off bombs and kill in the name of God. Well, he's trying to be polite here. I mean, yes, it is about that. And it is also quite anti-Christian, which is a good thing. But he's not fighting with this dying religion like some anti-theists. Science good, religion bad. It is much more nuanced. It is much smarter and much more powerful than that. Although, it must be noted that the depiction of Hypatia in the movie downplays her role as a Platonist philosopher, or a Neoplatonist philosopher, which is a more recent term that tries to separate Middle Platonism from Plotinus and later developments. When people like Iamblichus and Proclus essentially transformed Platonism into some sort of religion. So, historical Hypatia wasn't probably a hardcore atheist at all. And yes, she was more or less a scientist in the modern sense of the word. But there was no real separation between science and philosophy back then. What I really like about Agora, and what, among other things, helps it to stand out is first, it is a rare movie that doesn't engage in gross misinterpretation of ancient Greek and Roman culture. And second, it features a more or less reasonable depiction of this clash of cultures, the Greek and Roman culture, although not a traditional one, since we're talking about the 4th and 5th century here, and this clash with the Christian culture, so to speak. We got used to that depiction of nice Christians who are tortured by cruel Romans, sent to lions, and crucified on the burning crosses. All that stuff that never actually happened and exists only in Christian mythology. And here we have something different, something more based on reality. This depiction of Christians is probably much more realistic. I use the word probably a lot because, as I mentioned before, the quality of the sources for late antiquity is horrible. I even made a short video about this problem. It is called 3 Important Sources on Late Antiquity. And I actually consider it one of the best videos on this channel so far. It has a very boring title, not exactly the clickbait material, but it is also one of the funniest videos so far. And this is where I talk about some of the problems we have with the sources. So when we're talking about early Christianity, when we're talking about Hypatia or anything that happened during this period, I think we should use words like probably, possibly, maybe. We should use them a lot. The sources are quite unreliable. These are mostly the church sources, religious propaganda, deliberate falsifications, and as a consequence, we often don't know much about things like early Christianity. We know only what the Christians tell us. But their stories about the history of their religion are as authentic as the stories from the Book of Mormon. We can't be sure about what was happening in Alexandria in the 4th century. That's where the movie starts. We don't know much about Christian communities and how Christian they were. I know that many people would probably criticize me for that, but we have zero evidence that Christianity existed in the 1st century. We pretty much have zero evidence that it existed in the 2nd. And things become complicated when we get to the 3rd and the 4th centuries, because all of the evidence is contaminated by Christian propaganda and Christian forgeries. So, all these stories about early church councils, early Christian communities, details of Christian theology for this period, well, we don't know for sure. And in fact, we can't even be sure about the origins of Christianity. We can talk endlessly about this. What is important right now, precisely because of this problem, when we're watching Agora, we can say that, okay, that's how it happened, and this is just an invention, and it contradicts history. There can be theories. Like, there is this episode when Christians destroy the temple of Serapis. And you might have a lot of questions about that. Technically, there are a couple of sources, like literally a couple of sources, that mention the destruction of the temple in the year 391, or somewhere around the year of 391. But the cult of Serapis is probably one of the direct precursors of Christianity and one of the most important influences on Christianity. I'll make a video about this at some point. So it looks a bit weird. Yeah, you can make sense out of that. It's not like early Christians are in fact destroying their own temple. You can have theories. But you should give credit to Alejandro Amenábar and his co-writer Mateo Hill and the historical consultant Justin Pollard for the attempt to construct their story based on the sources. Yes, regardless of their probable authenticity, but based on the accepted mainstream convention. They usually don't invent stuff, but follow the established historical narrative, which is a reasonable approach. The sources about the life of Hypatia are, as you can imagine, are quite scarce. There are like 4 more or less primary sources that briefly describe some aspects of Hypatia's life, plus a couple of sources that make passing comments about her. And some secondary sources that are a bit weird, like the Byzantine encyclopedia called Suda, which actually contradicts itself in its entry about Hypatia. Like, first it says that she was married, and then it says that she was never married. Things like that. What is considered the primary sources on Hypatia are, first, the ecclesiastical history by Socrates Scholasticus, which is attributed to the 5th century. And it is obviously a Christian source, and in fact a sequel to the incredibly unreliable church history of Eusebius. Then we have the letters of Synesius, a bishop who is actually a character in the movie. Same problem here, this is a Christian source. Then there is a strange, supposedly the 7th century source with a strange history called The Chronicle, written by John, Bishop of Nicaea. Not really a primary source, if you ask me. And John is quite hostile against Hypatia and kind of approves of her brutal murder. And we have something from the surviving fragments of the life of Isidorus by Damascus, a Neoplatonist philosopher. Obviously, he is deeply sympathetic towards Hypatia, a fellow Platonist. So, as I've said before, the movie tries to be respectful to the sources that we have, the sources I've just mentioned. Of course, there are certain deviations since we're talking about the work of fiction. But this work of fiction is based on historical material, even if it's bad material. While the majority of movies about antiquity usually ignore the historical aspect almost entirely. Another interesting element I'd like to talk about, probably the last thing I'd like to emphasize here. Otherwise, I'll end up talking for 45 minutes again, like in the case of this movie review of Gladiator. Okay, another important and interesting thing in Agora, you should note, is the presence of Parabalani. I might be wrong, but it is probably the only movie in existence that depicts Parabalani. They are vaguely mentioned in some of the Christian sources, which is very interesting. Christians like to show these early Christians like they do in Quo Vadis, but they choose not to show this abomination. Christians don't really like to talk about the Parabalani like at all. It is amusing that any information about them was preserved, and it shows a very interesting link of the early Christian cults with the burial colleges of antiquity. Parabalani were essentially a group of undertakers employed by the church as the enforcers of sorts. lots of questions here about this mysterious brotherhood and about the genesis of Christianity in general. When people say that Christianity is some sort of a death cult, well, yeah, it's not only theology, not only human sacrifices and churches made of human skulls. They literally employed the undertakers as their death squads. And these Christian death squads are believed to be directly involved in the murder of Hypatia, probably on the orders of the Patriarch of Alexandria, Saint Cyril, who is also a character in Agora, obviously. Okay, let's sum this all up, kind of. It is a good Christmas movie, a good family movie for the holiday season, a movie you should watch with your kids. It has a very powerful and reasonably accurate depiction of what they are dealing with when it comes to the Abrahamic religions. They are not really dealing with spirituality. So, this movie also partially answers the question of what is your problem with Christianity? You can see why atheism, in the modern sense of the word, developed precisely in the Christian world. Greeks and Romans never had serious problems with their religion. It was quite a benevolent framework and it allowed a lot of free thinking, including quite atheistic free thinking. Like, Xenophanes, a pre Socratic philosopher, once famously said that if cattle or horses or lions had hands and could draw and could sculpt like men, then the horses would draw their gods like horses and cattle like cattle. And it was considered a wise saying of a wise man. Much later, Neoplatonists actually thought that it's these Christians who should be called atheists, in the original ancient meaning of the word, not in the modern one. The original meaning is more like godless people who believe in nonsense. If you really love antiquity and the culture of ancient Rome, you can't be a Christian. That's just schizophrenia. Thank you for watching, and see you soon.